All right, guys, what's up? We got the cheap beer. We got Jenny Light. We got the Tucher, which is one of the cheapest German beers, which is actually really good. But more important than that, I got guess who's back on the beast, the East Coast, James Lafond, the man, the one everyone's asking about. The E celeb, that just can't be, he's living it up. So, I figured I would ask you an interesting question. Um, on the Myth of the 20th Century podcast, you were dropping a lot of knowledge, right? The professor, I keep telling you that this dude should be making six figures at some Ivy League, like, bringing the young female legal age students back for some brandy and to discuss. I mean, this guy has thesis, like 14 theories that I think are amazing. But anyway, so what I'm gonna get into is I keep talking about Indians all the time. I know some people are like, "Oh, Indians, fuck them." Okay, well, like I keep saying, we are the Indians. Also, we are the Italians. We are the looked down upon lower white people at this point because, like I said, this is all this stuff is being put on you by whole white bourgeois rich people, okay, amongst others. But they're the ones really making it. They're making they're putting it over the top to fuck you. So now I'm going to discuss it with the Indians because here's the Indian expert. Um, I guess I would say, in terms of the future of how people should conduct themselves, we see that what happened to the Indians. Okay, and we see that eventually they were driven out, and you had some guys fighting. You had mentioned a bunch of mentioned a bunch of leaders before, different leaders. Could you go through some of those leaders, their names, what tribe they were with, what conflict they were with, and what, if anything, were they able to accomplish anything? And if they didn't, what was the reason they weren't able to?
Okay. The different tribes used alliances with European powers to preserve themselves against enemy tribes. Enemy tribes were always the number one problem. If you were an Indian tribe and you lost a war against one of the European nations or against the Americans, it was probably because of the Indian allies that they arrayed against you. So until the British finally lost, uh, until the French lost to the British, the most Indian tribes could maintain independence by acting as proxies for their European sponsor in return for equipment that they could use. The musket uh, had great value in the woods because if you hit a branch or some undergrowth with a musket ball, it could send it off some, but it's not like an arrow where the thing might fishtail and change
Oh
directions
yeah.
on you. Okay. And when you're talking about a battle where there's volley fire, it's just kind of really important that you get your rounds in this certain area. It's it was a big deal. Well, then uh, once the British take over, uh, the Indians are able to get supplies from the British to try to keep the Americans in check. But then once the Americans win and the British go away, then the tribes no longer have different European arms suppliers to keep them in business. And they had depleted their fur resources to the point where they were dependent upon European textiles
Mm.
for clothing. Their fur resources were depleted to get their guns and their steel and their powder and their shot.
Like they depleted it.
They did. It was,
Yeah.
it wasn't European trappers that were doing it. They did it in competition with each other. The Beaver Wars ran from the 1600s, the mid 1600s through the mid 1700s. It's about 100 years. The tonnage of furs that were exported was just ridiculous. So eventually, the all the various tribes are in a supply crisis because um, they're they can still find enough game to to feed themselves, but they would have to migrate to do it, and then in doing so, they would open themselves up to their land being taken over by squatters.
Mm.
They were basically, Europeans that were escaping the whole slave matrix, and then they've got to deal with that. Well, some of the leaders, there was, we talked about King Philip before last year. The At the same time, the Susquehannocks were fighting a war against Maryland, Virginia, and the Algonquins in
Mm.
Maryland. Uh, and they were initially successful, but they ended up being largely wiped out by a tribe of Indians that lived on the island that is now on the site of Riley, North Carolina.
Huh.
They were eventually screwed over by these people, who were then murdered by their English allies while they were, celebrating the victory.
The British were really good allies, apparently.
Now, these guys, their 5 principal chiefs were all murdered by Marylanders and Virginians under a flag of truce. So the actual chiefs that then successfully brought Maryland and Virginia to their knees with only 100 warriors, and they were protecting 300 to 400 non-combatants. They're unnamed. We don't know who they were. There are many Delaware chiefs and Iroquois chiefs that are, and the Susquehannocks became part of the Iroquois Confederacy
Oh.
that have names in treaties. Most of the Delaware names are Irish and English as far as their chiefs go. The majority of the Iroquois names were actually indigenous names, although you did have some major chiefs that were half-breeds that had English names, like Joseph Brant.
Yeah.
The name of the Delaware chief that gave the speech in, I think, around 1750 at the start of the French and Indian War.
Oh, yeah, to Philadelphia, the
Right,
Quakers.
in Philadelphia. I forget his name, but none of the Delaware chiefs became major leaders, and the chiefs that did sign treaties with the British and the Americans, even to include a treaty signed around Pittsburgh, in which they were promised a Delaware state for their tribe. These people didn't become well known because they were just turned upon by their English and American allies
Mm.
and sidelined. The chiefs that became well known were the ones that fought extensive campaigns against the British and then Americans. So the first would be Pontiac in 1765. Who has an initial successful uprising against the British, and he will eventually, he lets this go to his head. He starts to take on British pretensions. He initially claims that he is a Frenchman,
Uh-huh.
and then later on he claims that he is the British gatekeeper for all Indian tribes, and they have to have the relationship with the Great Father, the King, through him. There's the next major leader is Turtle. We call him Little Turtle. That's a mistake, but his name was Turtle, and he was probably the most interesting of all of these characters. He fights his battles. He's a boy apparently during Pontiac's time. He fights his battles around 17 from 17 from the late 1770s in the American Revolution up to 1790 after the American Revolution, where he's fighting the Americans. So initially, he basically all his combat was against Americans. Then a man that whose father was killed in the 1760s in Lord Dunmore's War. Puckenswaw. Puckenswaw was a chief, war chief of the Shawnee. Turtle was, I think, a chief of the Miami. I'm not sure. There was the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee. They were all involved in these pretty complicated alliances with each other. Pontiac might have been in Miami. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of hazy on those tribes. The Turtle, I'm pretty certain he was in Miami. He was active after the death of Puckenswaw, who was a Shawnee. Puckenswaw's youngest son, Tecumseh, ends up becoming a major leader of the tribes. He's the only real pan-Indian leader. Pontiac made a play at being a pan-Indian leader, but it didn't really happen. Tecumseh took his example and tried to do a much more deft political job with it, in concert with his brother, who's a religious leader. As Turtle was living out his last years in peace, he had made peace with America, Tecumseh was leading the Shawnees against them. Then there is the next great warrior in the East is Black Hawk, who was a chief of the Sauk Indians, who were allied with the Fox.
Oh, wow.
And he...
I never really heard of that guy.
So he is from the Illinois region, and Illinois meant land of superior men.
Right.
The most powerful Indian tribes were in the Illinois country. They're sitting on a crossroads between the western tribes and the eastern tribes, so they're in a similarly strong position to the tribe that murdered the Susquehannocks for the English in 1676.
But at that point, Illinois, all that area was French, right?
Well,
it wasn't purchased yet.
The Ohio country, Illinois, was explored by the French. They set up settlements, but they didn't try to claim ownership over anything more than a trading post.
Okay.
And they just allied and traded with the tribes.
Right.
The English didn't really take over that territory. They just took over the French forts,
right,
and they maintained alliances with the tribes in order to suppress westward migration
by the Americans,
of their unruly Americans.
Right.
So there wasn't a real attempt at ownership by the French or the British in that region. The French explored it first. The French established a strong presence in the Ohio country around 1700. You know, about 50 years before the British start making inroads into that country. But they had explored it 100 years earlier. The French actually spent a period of time, essentially the entire 1600s, exploring and developing trade relationships with the tribes in the Great Lakes and all along the Mississippi littoral, down to New Orleans.
Right.
So they had these
New Orleans, St. Louis.
They had long pre-existing relationships that were based on trade, and it wasn't just trade; it was giving. It was gift giving.
Right.
The key dynamic. People want to erase the Great White Father, okay, which is what the American president ended up becoming.
Yeah. Right.
Before that, it was the Great British Father. Before that, it was the Great French Father and the Great Spanish Father.
Right. Well,
and
the Spanish were there before everybody. Yeah.
His son, who would be the local governor. For instance, the Spanish governor of St. Louis became the conduit to the Great Spanish Father for a while. Yeah. And this is based on the gift-giving traditions of all tribal societies in Asia, in Europe, and North America, in which a successful war leader would give stuff away
Right.
to get loyalty, so he could be successful war leader
All
tomorrow.
right. So we're gonna wrap this up with this, but that's a lot of good. We're gonna go to the next one.